Hey friends, Devin here with Backcountry Exposure. I am excited to share this interview, sit-down discussion with Henry Shires from Tarptent today. Henry and I spend some time going over the history of Tarptent, but also dig into the nitty-gritty details of tent design, fabric use cases, and just go through some of these nerdy details of tent design and fabrics and such. So I hope you enjoy this. Well, Henry, I am very grateful for you to take the time to come hang out with me today to talk about Tarptent. This is something I've actually looked forward to for a long time because over the past few years, I've become a huge fan of Tarptent. When I purchased my first tent from you, which was the double rainbow lithium, and that just like was, I don't know, the rabbit hole that I fell into of really enjoying a lot of the tarp tent products. So thanks for taking the time and
Oh yeah,
being
my
here with
pleasure.
me today. So I've got several questions to ask you, but I think just to give everybody that's watching maybe a quick origin of how tarp tent got started and kind of what led you to what you're doing today.
Well, this is probably not politically correct, but I'm going to blame my wife, Cynthia, because I didn't have any intention of starting a company. But I actually, so a long time ago now, 25 years, I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. And I had a bunch of old backpacking gear. And I was sort of trying to look at what still worked and what didn't for this big hike. And anyway, I ended up buying a sewing machine and sewing a few things like some clothing and then a simple tarp structure because the tent I had wasn't going to work. It was too big and too heavy. And I thought, well, I'll just, I could probably get by with a tarp, right? And there's like, well, the problem with the tarp
Hmm.
is it doesn't keep the bugs out. So I knew that was a problem. But I liked simplicity. So I sort of designed this tarp thing that had some mosquito netting on the sidewalls and on the doors and windows and all that stuff. So, and it's like, well, what is this thing? I don't know. It's a tarp and it's a tent. It's sort of somewhere in between. It's a tarp tent. And I published some plans on the internet for how to make one. And then there was an old site actually called backpacking.net, which I think is still
Okay.
around. I think the founder is pretty much checked out, but it still kind of exists. Anyway, I published some plans on that site way back when, and I over time I kept getting requests from people saying, "Can you? That looks cool. Can you make me one?" I was like, "No, I hate
Hmm.
sewing. Are you kidding me? But here's some plans. Have fun with it." And then my
Right.
wife, Cynthia, borrowed it from me the following year to go hike the John Muir Trail. And, I thought it was perfect for her. And she came home and complained it was too hard to set up. Like, what? What do you mean? I lived in that thing for 4.5 months. It's perfect. All right, fine. I'll make you something easier to set up. And so when I went to work, I thought it would take me a weekend. It took me months. I didn't know what I was doing. Anyway, by the time I kind of came up with something better, which ultimately turned into our first two products called the Virga and the Squall, which was sort of
Okay.
tents, arch pulls in the back, and then a single pull up front. I had in the interim talked, I had a hiking friend of a friend who was a seamstress, and I sort of worked it out with her. If you're interested, I could maybe find some people who might want to have, I'll just send you their business because they want these things made. So it all just sort
Hmm.
of evolved from there. And, we launched tarptent.com on tax day of 2002, I think. Um,
Oh wow.
and, I thought we would get a few orders, kind of other crazy hikers. And then we got like 30 orders the first day, which just blew me out of the water because I no idea. I literally had no idea that there'd be that kind of interest in such a thing. And I had no manufacturer.
At the time, was it you were taking the orders and then building them to order, or did you have a stock and then
No, I
that's
had
what
no
you were able
stock.
to?
So originally I just took an order. I thought I would just maybe have a 5 orders that I would send to my friend or my friend's sister, and she would make them and send them back. And it would just be a side thing. It'd be an hour or two a week kind of, side business
Gotcha.
thing. Anyway, so it sort of went on that way for 2 or 3 years. And then we found real manufacturing in Seattle. And it just evolved from there. And, but it was never planned. It just sort of grew organically. And then with respect to what's next after that, I just, it's sort of ideas just sort of come to me kind of random in random ways. It's like, well, like the first, I remember the first like aha moment I had was, so these two tents, the Virga and the Squall, had an arch pole in the back, as I said, and a front pole. And I'm not a trekking pole user. So we used to ship these tents with an arch pole and a single front pole, lightweight aluminum folded pole. And people would get the tents and they go, well, this is great. I like the tent a lot, but I'm just going to use my trekking pole because I don't, why bother with your pole when I have my, and it was like, oh, of course, duh. But I wasn't a trekking
Right,
pole user.
right.
So it never occurred to me at all.
Yeah.
So that was completely serendipitous that we would make a tent that you could repurpose your trekking poles for, right? That idea has just never occurred to me. So that just happened. And then, of course, over time, now we have lots of trekking pole tents. But originally, it was just not in my quiver.
Well, and at the time there weren't very many options of tarp style shelters. I know
Yeah.
that
No, that's true.
within that time frame, maybe a
Yeah.
5-10 year span, you had like Go Light
Yep.
came out
Yep.
with that Mount Laurel Designs with their mid.
Hmm.
Not sure where all of that is, but
Hmm.
they were all pretty simple
Yeah.
shelters at the time,
Yeah, they were. Yeah. Yeah.
based off of tarp. And
Yeah.
so that first one that you made,
Hmm.
was it really similar to what the preamble is
Yeah. Yeah,
now?
that's exactly what it was. It was a smaller version of today's preamble. Yeah. Not quite as refined. I mean, that one I didn't. So back in those days, I really had no idea about things like catenary curves and just doing what you need to because I didn't have any I had no specific like computer aided design tools, so it was all sort of
Mm.
haphazard. But anyway, so yeah, but the preamble now is essentially a modified, larger version of my original tent. Yes, that's true.
So where, because I think one of the most classic designs that has come from Tarp Tent over the years is the rainbow.
Hmm.
What's the origin of that, and kind of the design
Yeah.
inspiration that, because it's such a simple
Hmm.
tent.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you really break it down, it's very
Hmm.
simple, the single arch pole,
Yeah.
but it's a very usable and
Yeah.
lightweight tent, and you don't really see very many other manufacturers putting out that style.
Yeah. So what drew me to that or thinking about that was, again, I'm not a trekking. I wasn't a trekking pole user then, and I'm still not.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, I need something for me that's got some usable room, and that I don't need trekking poles at all for. It's just, we started out, as I said, with the Verg and the Squaw, which had an arch pole in the back, but the arch pole was way too small to sort of sleep under, right? So I wanted something with a bigger
Mm.
arch pole. And then it's like, well, okay, so I started thinking about, well, if I did a single arch pole in the middle, and then there's a problem with the geometry up by your head unless you expand it somehow with a single arch pole over your middle. So I thought add the little top strut to give you some headroom.
Right.
Um, and and honestly, I'm sure there were other arch pole tents on the market back in those days. I didn't do a lot of research, but I know I'd seen an arch pole design somewhere. But what was unique for us and still is because it's patented is the idea that you could use trekking poles if you have them to turn that into a freestanding setup. So
Hmm.
I don't know. That just came to me one day. It was like, well, if I had trekking poles, I don't need them vertically because that's what the arch pole does. But what if I lay them horizontally? What could I do with that? And it just occurred to me that I could use them to tension off the end of the arch pole and then out to the corners, and that supports the structure. So now you have four supported four supported points to ground and the arch pole through the middle, so that freestands. So
Yeah, that makes
that was
sense.
that was the invention more than just the simple arch pole with a cross strut. Yeah.
Yeah, at least for me, that whole design made a lot of sense. I know later down the road you released the lithium
Mhm.
line, which introduced
Mhm.
Dyneema, but
Mhm.
when I was looking for the lightest weight tent that had the most usable living space in it, that I could also use in pretty much any
Mhm.
pitching condition that I
Mhm.
wanted,
Mhm.
it was really easy for me to get into that trap and mindset of like, well, there's several 1 pound single person trekking pole Dyneema tents out there,
Mhm.
and any of them would work,
Mhm.
right? But that wasn't really the point. The point was, find a shelter that I can set up on slick rock, that
Mhm.
sets up in sand, that can be freestanding, gives me the most usable space,
Mhm.
and saves me as much weight as
Mhm.
makes sense without going to an extreme.
Yeah.
And I mean, that double rainbow lithium is 29 ounces
Yeah.
when all is said and done. And it's pretty cool that like we're in a phase of gear development and technology where you can have all of those check boxes and still have a fully enclosed shelter at that weight and not be like crazy expensive. I mean, denim is not cheap. We know that. But in terms of like what else came down the line, like obviously you've got other one person, two person, even 3 and 4 person shelters. Where do you pull a lot of your like design from?
I do have a physics degree, so that helps
Okay,
with understanding structure and tensions and
geometry
all
and
that stuff. Yeah. But no, but a lot, it all ultimately comes down to my personal sort of needs for my own shelters. That's really what all this stuff ultimately comes down to, and with variations. And then over time, I've worked on little design elements that work, little structural elements that work, and then it's about recombining them to make new structures. Do you know what I mean? So like the pitch
mhm.
lock corner was something we first introduced a long time ago, like
Yeah.
15 years ago. And that we've introduced into a lot of other models because I think it works for what it's intended to do, which is to create a lot of ensure usable volume at that location, to shorten up the overall footprint needed for a tent. And then it folds flat, so it lives in the fly, so it's not something you sort of construct to set up your tent. It's already there. But anyway, we've repurposed that into a number of different designs because it's a little element which can be combined with other elements, other trekking poles or arch poles or some combination thereof to create whole new structures. But it but the design process for me is very much organic, and it's like, well, what would work for me and my family? So like the hogback, for example, that's you mentioned we make larger tents. That that
Yeah.
that's a, that tent was specifically for my family use, which at the time was me, my wife, my dog, my 100-pound dog, and my young son. So I just needed something. There wasn't anything on the market that I wanted that worked for the four of us. So that's what drove that idea. But I would like to say that I'm very structured and organized, and it's all about this week I'm going to do that. It's not the way it works with me. It just happens. I don't know.
Do you find yourself doing like a lot of research of other brands, or is it simply in that usability? Like, what does this design provide? How do we improve on it,
The
or that
research
kind
that
of
I do
thing?
in other brands, it's not so much design explicitly based. I definitely look at the materials that are in use in other tents for sure.
Okay.
And where are we on the materials line, and how do we compare, and can we get better? Or, what are the materials trade-offs? Maybe we can get into this, but I've sort of, I think now of I call it skins and skeletons. So shelters. I mean, humans have been making shelters a long time, right? And originally it was
Right.
all about using kind of animal bones or tree trunks or whatever, and then animal skins, and that's sort of like, yeah, that was your original shelter, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
know, but the same idea has been around for a long time. It's just like, how do we support some sort of skin, some sort of fabric that over our living space? And a lot of what I do now now that I'm into sort of high end CAD design it's really all about starting with the person or the people, and then sh- and then creating a structure that goes over them, right? So you have to start with what is it that you're sheltering, and then you have to create a structure that
Right.
goes over them, and then so that then sort of limits, or at least um, um, guides your design thinking, because you have to worry about, well, what's the usable, what's the wall angle at the ends? Like, am I going to hit, or someone going to hit their feet in their head at each end? Or what if they sit up and move around and throw their elbows out and whatever? So that's much more my design thinking now. It's like, what happens with humans when humans do human things inside a tent? Does it work?
Yeah. I guess I see that um, pretty specific in a tent like the dipole, which
Yeah,
has
definitely.
become one of my favorite shelters.
Oh, good.
I
Yeah,
mean, you and I have emailed about
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
You know my love for it, but I see those elements
Mhm,
in
mhm.
the way that the head end, the foot end are to bring that height up with the end strut
Yeah,
to make it so that, because typically those A-frame shaped shelters, they're so steep at the feet
yeah,
that
exactly.
now we're in 4-inch tall sleeping pads
Yeah. Yeah.
and really lofted sleeping bags, and you got tall people that need that space to not be
Right.
rubbing their feet
Right.
and the
Right.
head of their sleeping bag on condensation. So
Yeah.
yeah, I like that. I like that principle. That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned fabrics and talking
Mhm.
about materials. I kind of want to dig into the use of the different fabrics that over time have
Mhm.
been introduced and kind of where we're going
Mhm.
with fabrics,
Mhm.
specifically with Ultra TNT now
Mhm.
being available as an option on the market.
Mhm.
But traditionally and originally, pretty much everything was nylon that you
Mhm.
were producing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We started with nylon and continued that way until really the last maybe 5 years or so. Um, Nylon's kind of tried and true. It's been around for tense and long. There's no perfect fabric. I'll just state that right up front, as you well know,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
but it's, for the cost, the strength, the waterproofness, the dirt, I think it does what it does quite well. There are limitations to nylon, and notably stretch when wet. I think is the biggest one in
Hmm.
my mind. There are some limitations with UV. Although for most people, if you're gonna set up your tent and move on the next day, it's immaterial. It doesn't matter. If you're
Sure.
leaving your tent out in the direct sun all day long for weeks at a time, it would matter. Where people now have sort of landed with nylon is the fault of nylon, if there is one, is the stretch when wet. And so they've sort of, the idea is, well, what solves that? Well, a polyester fabric would solve that because polyester
Hmm.
doesn't really absorb any water when wet. And so it retains its shape when wet. Polyester is not as strong as nylon. And so you have to be a little bit more careful with how you reinforce the stress points with it. But it's a nice alternative to nylon. It too has stretch. This is where people don't quite understand stretch so much. So stretch is a function of both the fiber in the fabric, nylon or polyester, stretching or not stretching under stress. But it's also a function of what happens with the structure of the fabric, with the weave, with the way that the fabric is constructed of threads going different directions, right? What happens when
Hmm.
you stress that material? And so polyester also stretches under load, right? So it distorts, it has a grid, but when you pull on it, especially diagonally through the weave, it will stretch in response. And so basically, what does that mean in the real world? What happens is that the fabric then moves in the wind or under wind load, under snow load. The fabric will move in response. Even if it doesn't get worse when wet, it still moves in response. And so I've seen plenty of polyester materials that are worse under wind load than nylon is under wind load because of
Hmm.
this bias stretch problem.
But it's not necessarily like an elongation of the fiber the way that nylon does.
It's if you take a square and you sort of squish it, right, it turns into a parallelogram or whatever it is. And so the actual area of the thing bounded by certain fabric lines changes, and so it gets
Sure.
elongates in certain dimensions. And so um,
Gotcha.
yeah, that's the downside. So where that's essentially stopped now is in Dyneema or Ultra TNT. Is you don't get that kind of elongation. Well, you do actually in Dyneema. We can go through that, but in the short term anyway, you don't get the long under wind load. The fabric doesn't go anywhere. There's no stretch like there is with nylon and polyester. So that to
Hmm.
me is the biggest design upside, or the biggest upside to that material is the non-movement in the wind of that material.
Yeah, the fabric science of all of this is really interesting
Hmm.
when you really break it down into just simple terms. It doesn't have to be super scientific, but just
Yeah,
the pros and cons. What is the application? What are you trying to get performance wise out of the product?
yeah, yeah,
And I do think that oftentimes a lot of people focus solely on the weight
yeah,
of something,
yeah.
and because Dyneema is that catalyst for
Hmm.
providing
Hmm.
the opportunity to save as much weight as possible, it kind of becomes the blinders of, well,
Hmm.
where does that
Yeah,
performance really happen?
sure.
And I think there's not always a full understanding of
Yeah,
what can happen to that fabric if it's not pitched correctly, or you add things to Dyneema. I think I'd seen actually a comment on social media or something about like putting panel pullouts on mid panels of a Dyneema tent,
Mhm.
and then putting that under load and tension, what that can actually do to the fabric versus like a polyester or a nylon that has
Yeah.
those qualities that
Rebound.
allow for that flexibility.
So nylon and polyester have what's called rebound. So if you stretch the fabric, if you stress the fabric, it will stretch or elongate, or depending on the material, in response to the stress. But then when you release the stress load, it rebounds. So it goes back to its original shape. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dyneema has no way to do that because the nature of Dyneema is it's a laminate fabric, and the Dyneema fiber grid is essentially non-stretch. It doesn't distort, or if you pull on it, it doesn't elongate. There's no rebound to a Dyneema grid, but on the other hand, it's not applicable because it doesn't stretch at all.
It's kind of like if you pull the plastic of a grocery bag,
Yeah,
once you've stretched that plastic, it's
yeah,
not like you
yeah.
can't
That's
come
where I'm going
back.
with it. So the Dyneema, so the
Okay.
fiber grid in Dyneema doesn't doesn't elongate, it doesn't stretch. So it rebounds not really a thing because it doesn't need to be a thing. But the problem with Dyneema is the mylar layers. This is sort of the thin plasticky stuff that gives it the waterproofness. And per your plastic bag analogy, yes, when you stretch mylar, there is no rebound possible. You've stretched it, it elongates, it never goes back to its original form. So it puckers essentially under stress. And so
Gotcha.
and
Gotcha.
so this is the problem with mid-panel pullouts that you just mentioned on Dyneema tents, is that at first glance it sounds like a good idea. Oh, I'll just pull on it, and it'll expand it in whatever direction I want it to. I'll get more headroom or whatever. But now what'll happen is you will permanently deform the fabric. You'll get bubbling in the fabric. You'll get permanent stretch and deformation in the mylar layers, and that'll never come back to what it was before you stressed it. That's the problem with Dyneema. So you have
Gotcha.
to be very careful
Gotcha.
about how you reinforce Dyneema, the directions at which you exert stress on any particular point. You have to. So Dyneema has a fiber direction. So it's got vertical lines and horizontal lines in the fiber grid, and depending on how you want to create your tent and how you want to stress it, you have to cut the panels such that primarily you want those stress lines to follow the grid lines in Dyneema. It really matters which way you cut the material. It matters also in nylon and polyester, but not at all with respect to rebound. Your tent will always come back to its original shape when you stress it.
Sure. Sure. But I mean, with those other fabrics, you've
Yeah,
got
yeah.
certain bias
Yeah,
stretches
it certainly matters. If you want
and
your tent to perform well, you want to make sure you cut it directly so that the stress is along the fiber grid lines.
yeah.
But you don't worry about it damaging it under stress, wind load, because you've stretched the fabric in some permanent way.
Now that there is a newcomer
Mhm,
on the market,
mhm.
Challenge Sailcloth has developed and released the UltraTNT
Yeah.
fabric, which is, I think, it's a pretty interesting product in my mind,
Mhm.
because you would think, okay, well, there's Dyneema, there needs to be a competition to Dyneema, and I think in a big picture, maybe a lot of people are thinking, oh well, that didn't quite deliver to the point that it's
Mhm.
a actual competition weight wise against
Otherwise,
Dyneema,
yeah.
which I which I know there are. You can't just say that there's only one type of Dyneema. There's dozens of there's hybrids and the way that they're put together and all of that. So to say that this company uses a half ounce Dyneema, well, it may not be the exact same that is used as a half ounce weight for another company. So you have to do your research. But what's interesting to me about Ultra TNT is that it's quite drastically different in its construction
Mhm.
to Dyneema, in that you don't have as many actual fibers, but you've got that like 45 degree like or three direction of the fibers, and they're pretty spread out. Because my understanding is Tarptent has been one of the early adopters of Ultra TNT.
Yeah.
What has that process been like? Like, how long have you been working with
Challenge.
Challenge to
Yeah.
I don't know, get to the point that it was ready to be released
Well,
to the public?
we started working with them pretty early on, where they were still developing the fabric. So, for example, we were testing it a year and a half or so ago. Well, one of the things they were working on was increasing the opacity of the fabric, for example. So we got the
Mm.
first samples that we got were completely clear.
It's
Um,
just totally transparent.
yeah, transparent. Which for most people is not acceptable, especially if you're changing the plants or whatever. But so that's actually one of the nice things about Ultra TNT is that it is quite opaque relative to Dyneema. That's a
Right.
real that's a real upside to it. But no, we worked with them early on, and but back to the grid thing. Yes. So the big difference between Dyneema and Ultra TNT, actually, with respect to the deformation that we just talked about, is the addition of an additional fiber line, additional dimensionality to the fiber grid. So there are diagonal fiber lines in this material, which then much better handle problems with when you stress the fabric at some sort of off axis or off directional to the main fiber grid lines, if you follow me. So that better
Hmm.
stops, that better prevents elongation in the mylar layers under stress that's not quite maybe as intended or a little bit off angle to the basic stress lines on the tent as it exists. So in our testing and experience, the fabric holds up much better in the long term. So what you'll see with all Dyneema tents, especially the half ounce variety of Dyneema, is it'll start to look a little wonky. It'll get stretched. You'll see waviness in the along the hems and in the
Hmm.
zippers, and it sort of never looks, after some use, it never looks quite like it did when it was new because of that. And
And Dyneema over time, from being rolled up and pushed into a bag,
yeah,
it'll have a certain percentage of shrinking that'll take
yes,
place.
absolutely,
Like,
have some shrinkage, and that has to
is
do
there
with.
any of that quality in the Ultra?
So yes, but less so. And the reason,
Okay.
one reason you mentioned was the distance between the fiber grids, the fiber lines. So
Hmm.
the Ultra TNT that we've seen today anyway has a wider distance between the fiber grids. And so what happens when you worked with this material for a while, the hopefully rolling and light creasing and rolling is better than crumpling. But ultimately you're going to be crumpling the fabric. It's just a question of how much and how for how long. But the crumpling of the fabric starts to introduce little little micro creasing in the fabric. And that's then prevented from uncreasing by the Dyneema fiber grid. It's a combination of what's happening with the grid lines and then what's happening with the mylar lines, and all together you do start to get shrinkage overall in the fabric over time in most areas, and then you get elongation in other areas that are under stress. So the net result is it's, what was a perfectly oriented piece of, say, square fabric initially ends up all kind of wrinkled and rumpled, and it's not what it wants, what it was new. So and actually this has come up before, but where we're getting our Dyneema tents made, they actually do, I think they call it pre-crumpling or something like that, but they'll actually take the Dyneema fabric and they'll sort of wrinkle it, pre manipulate it to introduce the initial, there's sort of an initial set of initial shrinkage, and then it continues to shrink, but not nearly at the rate of the initial. There's an initial shrinkage, and then less so over time. So what they try and do is kind of pre crinkle it, pre rumple it, to kind of introduce that initial stretch, and then they take that fabric that's been handled to some extent, and then they make the tent out of it. So what
Gotcha.
comes out of the tent bag at first setup to the user is already a little bit kind of used. I hate to use that word, but it's used in the sense that the fabric has been manipulated to introduce some shrinkage to it, because it's going to happen anyway.
Where do you see the best application for the Ultra TNT? Because is it best applied only to a fly fabric, to the fly sheet?
Yeah, no, that's a good
Are you
question.
gonna?
So yeah, so all non-stretch materials have no way past a certain point to because they're non-stretch, they have no way to really absorb like a sharp point force. So like if you were to place a nylon fabric on a sharp ground. It's got little sticks and pebbles and whatever in it. The nylon at those micro points of contact between the sharp points and the fabric, the nylon can stretch. It kind of ooze around the sharp point under stress. Whereas Dyneema can't do that. It has no way to stretch except permanently, but it can't absorb those kind of sharp point forces the way nylon can. So it'll go from resisting the sharp point force to popped. There's no in between like there is with nylon. So
Okay.
we have until quite recently we've done Dyneema floors, but never with the half ounce Dyneema because that just is not good for floor material. We've used the tougher, thicker 1 ounce mylar, which is twice 1 ounce Dyneema, which is twice the mylar. The part of the material that's kind of most susceptible to damage that has twice as much mylar in it as the half ounce Dyneema. And as a floor material, it's not bad. It too eventually will break down, and because of this micro, all the folding increasing over time, and people will start to report what they call, pinholes in the fabric, which also happens in the fly. But you'll start to see
Hmm.
little water seepages going on in the floor all over the place, and you're not quite sure why because there's nothing visible going on, but it's fracturing that's happening in the mylar layers at a very micro level. So
Gotcha.
our going forward, we're really trying to phase out Dyneema flooring and going back to some sort of lighter weight nylon, which we've done with some of our newer models. There's no, again, it's a bit of a trade-off. You don't get quite the pressure resistance. Technically, if you were to measure the pressure resistance, Mylar or a Dyneema and Ultra would start out much, much higher than nylon, but over time it breaks down faster than nylon. So yeah, I don't know. It's a
Gotcha.
trade-off.
And you're talking like the hydrostatic head
Yeah,
of
hydrostatic head. Sorry.
that
Yes. Yes.
floor
Yeah,
material.
exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep. Yep.
Which that's always been an interesting thing for me because I don't live in a rainy state. I
Mhm,
don't live in a
mhm,
place where
mhm,
there's a lot of moisture. So I've
mhm,
never experienced a floor wetting out the way that
mhm,
maybe some people have said that
mhm,
I want a dynamo floor because of that
mhm,
pressure
mhm.
resistance and such. And I don't know. It's interesting how much performance is dependent and contingent on your location.
It's location to some extent, to the extent that your ground is wet or saturated, but even more so to the extent that you're literally camping in a puddle, right?
Right.
So this is where I think, especially if you're not sort of paying attention, it's easy to pitch in places where water will naturally pool, and you want to avoid those, especially with fabric that's a little bit dicey is the wrong word, but doesn't have the highest pressure rating. If you're camping in a literal puddle, that's where you're going to have problems. And so, I tend to tell people like look around and look to see if you see any obvious historical evidence of water flow through your area. You can kind of tell that water's flowed through your pitching area, right? Don't camp there if there's any chance of rain because it's just going to happen again. So try and camp up on higher areas where water can kind of flow off the mound, if you will, and not
Hmm.
into the pit where you're camped.
Well, so I guess at that point it kind of becomes a matter of saturation and
Yes.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
that, and
Yeah. So,
that's
no,
where you're wetting out.
and I totally get it. There are areas where if you're camped in some sort of boggy area, there's not much you can do. The ground is it's a sponge. It's just holding water. But in lots of places, there are preferred places to camp that are noticeably drier even when it's hard raining than other areas because the water's flowing away from your area, not soaking under your area. And then
Gotcha.
I always tell people, so this is where the subject of ground sheets comes up, and so ground
That's the question I was going to ask.
okay. So ground sheet, I recommend ground sheets certainly for areas that are rocky, spiny, where I tell people use the hand test. You put your hand on the ground. If it's sharp to your hand, it's going to be sharp to the floor. So
Hmm.
do the right thing and don't pitch there if you can. If you have to, put a ground sheet down. Um, and then in the worst possible case, so what happens with all floors over time is they wear out, right? Eventually you're gonna puncture a floor, it's gonna break down. At that point, it seems a little counterintuitive, but I tell people at that point, put the ground sheet, if you have one, down on the inside of the floor. because now any water
Hmm.
that gets through the floor now has another layer to get through before it gets to you, which is now the ground sheet between you and and no longer just the floor itself. But so hydrostatic head, right? So Dyneema and Ultra TNT have off the charts hydrostatic head when new, and you couldn't possibly force water through that fabric when it was new. But much lower hydrostatic head just by the numbers, down in a few thousand, is almost always enough to keep water from getting in. That's still so. I think people don't quite understand what hydrostatic head means. So if you have, let's just pick a number like 2,000, okay, 2,000 millimeters. That's a column of water 2 meters high. So if you can think about, basically a column of water that's as high as a 6 foot human being, right? That's a lot of
Yeah.
weight. That's what hydrostatic head means. So typically, if you're spread out on a pad inside your tent, your body weight is fairly well distributed. It's certainly most, where your butt probably contacts the pad, but generally you've distributed your weight a bit, and so you don't tend to see so much problems there. Certainly, if you're in there and you put all your weight on one knee, for example,
Hmm.
you've concentrated your entire weight into a very small little surface area, and that dramatically increases the pressure needed or pressure rating of the floor that would be needed to keep the water that's under the floor from getting in because you put so much pressure on the floor. But generally, if you're well spread out, that the pressure rating on most flooring is enough unless there's physical damage to the floor.
So is that why you see in a lot of nylon or polyester tents, the floor fabric is a higher denier because it allows for a higher hydrostatic head because
Yes.
your body
Yes.
weight on there and gear sitting on the floor of the
Yes.
tent,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily always translate to,
Yeah.
well, higher denier is more abrasion resistant and a stronger fabric. Obviously that's true
Yeah.
because it's a
Yeah.
bigger fiber,
Yeah.
but um, yeah, I hadn't honestly hadn't
Yeah.
ever thought that higher hydrostatic head on the floor translated to that application.
Yeah, and then also, and this is the reason why flooring generally, if there's going to be a hydrostatic distinction between your floor and your fly, it's you want a higher pressure rating on your floor. The fly rating is if so what does the fly need to stop? Well, the fly needs to stop raindrops, right? And you can have wind driven raindrops, but raindrops, even hard rain, doesn't get anywhere near the pressure, doesn't exert anywhere near the pressure rating on a fly to warrant 5,000 millimeters. That's just way overkill. It's just
Mm-hmm.
water, even high water, high wind driven water doesn't exert that kind of pressure on fabrics. But
Yeah,
certainly putting your full body weight on a large human being on a little point on your knee certainly could. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, because I've seen a lot of chatter about ultralight nylon tents, maybe freestanding variants that are 15, even 10 denier
Yeah.
for the fly and like 1200
Yeah.
hydrostatic
No, no,
head.
no.
It seems
And
really
I
small,
I agree, and
but
I wouldn't trust those. Not so much for the. So what happens with all materials is they degrade over time, right? So if it's
mhm.
1,200 when it's brand new, it won't be that after it's been used a few times out, right? It'll drop off, and then it
Sure,
starts to
because
get
the
yeah,
yeah, because UV plays into how the DWR treatment
yeah,
handles over
yeah,
time, and
yeah,
just that I mean, nylon is not waterproof by nature.
right, right,
It has to be
yeah,
calendared or
right,
uh,
right,
treated
right,
with a DWR or
yeah, yeah,
some kind of coating,
exactly,
and
exactly,
that's going to
yeah,
break down over time.
exactly, yeah, exactly. That's what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm interested in what other new developments, new
Hmm.
products, and things that you're
Hmm.
kind of working on.
Hmm.
I know today there was a post shared about a new freestanding shelter that's been in the works, but anything
Hmm.
else that is kind of coming down the pipeline that you'd
Well,
be
you
interested to
mentioned
share?
earlier about that you like the dipole one DW, so I can tell you we're working on a two-person version of the same tent.
Oh, cool. I know that'll
Um,
be that'll be popular.
yeah, no, I'm excited for it. I can I don't I have no timeline for it, but this is a thing that comes up frequently. I'm just gonna I'm gonna um, go slightly off tangent here a little bit, but one of the as a tent designer, one of the things that I've encountered over time, as all tent designers too, is changes in tent design are a f- are often a function of what's happening with related um, products, if you want to call them that, used by people also using the tent. So by that I mean there's a trend that's going on in the outdoor industry, which is that people get all excited about getting lighter and lighter and lighter, except that they want their luxuries, and that luxury turns into a large pad, right? A long, wide pad, right? And so a
25-inch wide pads. Yep.
long, wide, thick pad, right? And so, yeah, I'm fine. I'll carry a little extra because I'll be that much more comfortable. Okay, that's fine. But that then turns into it has an impact on tents, right? Because whereas two standard width pads might fit in your two-person tent, two wide pads won't, right? So then as a tent
Yeah.
manufacturer, I have to respond with, well, I'm going to need to make a wider tent now because that's the trend is people want to put two long wide pads in their tent. So now I have to
Where
respond, right? Um,
yeah, where 48 inches may have been an ideal size for a two-person tent.
yeah,
Now that's kind of
yeah,
out of the
exactly.
question for a lot
Yeah.
of people.
So in terms of tent design, that's always something we're struggling with is how do we either tweak the existing designs to make them long and wide enough now to accommodate that trend, or what do we have to do that's new? And so that's one trend. The other trend that we've seen over time is packs have gotten narrower and narrower. So
Hmm.
the tall, skinny pack now seems to be a thing for a lot of people, which is fine. But then it limits what you can do with how do you organize your gear inside, and especially with tents, right? Because the folded
Right.
size on a tent is often defined by the pole structure inside. So if you're
Right.
making arch pole tents or you're making tents with some sort of even trekking pole tents, but that have some, in our case, the pitch lock corners, some embedded carbon fiber tubing for other structural enhancements, that defines what you can do for pack size. So in prior years, a tent that might have fit horizontally in your pack no longer fits in your new high performance skinny tall pack, right? It's like, well, okay, now we have to go back and fix our tents now to make them pack narrower because it doesn't work with these newer packs. So
Right.
one of the things that we've heard a lot from people is, I love your insert product name here, but it packs too large because of the carbon fiber struts or the arch pole lengths being too long or whatever it is. So that's one thing that we had to work on going forward is, how do we respond to that? And so, we can make foldable, we can make poles and struts that fold to shorter pack lengths. That's one solution. We can make things, but the one thing that we're trying to investigate now is on these pitch lock tents is maybe we should, rather than doing folding, because that introduces more weight and more complexity, maybe we should introduce something that's just really easy to detach from the tent. So it's as more detachable than your arch pole, right? It just pops off and on.
Hmm.
So pop it off and stick it in your side pocket or whatever, and then the whole tent can be stuffed and you're good to go. It doesn't matter on your pack anymore.
Right.
So that
Yeah,
kind of
makes
thing.
sense.
It's responding to these changes is a big part of what we need to be doing is from a design standpoint going forward.
All of it is super interesting to me, and tents in general are just uh, they're one of my favorite aspects of spending time outside because I mean it's your oasis, it's your protection, it's your ability to get out of the elements, and you want that product to perform for you. And I've always appreciated what Tarp Tent and the designs that you've put together have been able to do from a performance standpoint and a usability standpoint. So I
Mhm.
appreciate that from a user standpoint,
Mhm. Mhm.
on what you're doing. Just want to say thanks for
Oh yeah.
spending the time and
Thank you.
sharing a little bit of behind the scenes
Mhm.
of Tarp Tent, and any recommendations on obviously your website tarptent.com, but then you're on social media as
Yep.
well, sharing
Yep.
updates and things.
Yep. And I always tell people you're welcome to call or email. I'm around to answer questions. So yeah.
Awesome,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, that's appreciated. I think a lot of people in the outdoor space just as much as you said that you appreciate being able to like have that communication with the customer
Yeah.
appreciates that they can
Yeah.
make a phone call
Yeah.
and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So that's awesome.
Cool.
Well, thanks again,
Yeah.
and
Thank you, sir.
really appreciate it.
All right. Great. Good talk to you.
I really just want to thank Henry again for taking time out of his day to share his thoughts and just provide a little bit of education around tent design. And hopefully you found some value out of this. If you did, give it a thumbs up, share it if you would like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and check out Tarptent's products. They are fantastic, really high performance, and I've just really enjoyed them personally for the backpacking and camping trips that I have used them on. I've got several videos of Tarptent products in my catalog of videos, so you can check those out. But thanks for watching today, guys. We'll catch you on the next one. See you later.